Good morning and welcome to the Economic Justice Australia Conference for 2022, System Integrity for Economic Security. I'm Leanne Ho, the CEO of Economic Justice Australia, and I'm joining you from Gadigal land, Aboriginal land which was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Good morning, Auntie Mary. Thank you for joining us. If you just want to turn your camera off for a moment, we'll come back to you when we're ready. Thank you, Mary. In a few moments, I will be handing over to the Chair of Economic Justice Australia, Genevieve Bolton, to officially open the conference and introduce Auntie Mary officially, who's going to give us the welcome to country. Sadly, Auntie Violet, who was advertised on the program, can't join us today as she's unwell. But thankfully, Auntie Mary was able to come in and join us at the last moment. In these few minutes before the official start, I thought I'd pop in and say a few words while people are logging on. I've just got a few notes here that have gone wrong, but let me just get back in the zone. So I'm going to say a few minutes before the official start. I thought I'd pop in and say a few words while people are logging in to join us. Today's sessions are all designed to be conversations between an expert from Economic Justice Australia who can share their experience of a topic from their casework at one of our member community legal centres, and an external expert who can position that experience of social security in a broader advocacy context. These sessions are focused around Economic Justice Australia's two key research areas, which we decided on back in June 2021, automation in social security and domestic violence reform to improve support to victims' survivors. Being a tiny organisation, we try to be strategic in how we direct our limited resources. I don't think we could have imagined back then just how much these choices would be aligned with the new government's reform agenda and the opportunities to make positive changes. Last Thursday, we had the announcement of the Robodebt Royal Commission, and we look forward to hearing from Minister Shorten today about that. Our centres were some of the first to sound the alarm about the flawed income averaging process having no legal basis. And we assisted people to appeal these debts to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. It is great to see our feedback reflected in the terms of reference for the Royal Commission. And in October, the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Their Children will be released, and we look forward to hearing from Minister Rishworth today about that and her consideration of our legislative brief setting out amendments to the Social Security Act. These amendments are designed to address the barriers to accessing Centrelink payments when fleeing domestic violence, as well as to stop the system being used as a weapon of violence and lumping victim survivors with Centrelink debts caused by their abusers. Economic Justice Australia will have a seat at the Jobs and Skills Summit later this week. I will be speaking about the barriers to navigating the system and the compliance-focused punitive nature of the system, which too often harms rather than supports job seekers' ability to participate in the paid workforce. The social security system has the potential to transform lives, taking people from crisis to a place where they can thrive. However, our legal systems too often see the system plunging people into further crisis. We need this to change if we want a system that supports people into paid work. A few housekeeping matters before we start. The sessions today will be recorded and posted up on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Please use the hashtags you see on the screen behind me to live tweet hashtag EJAConf2022 and hashtag System Integrity for Economic Security. We are delighted that over 150 of you with such diverse backgrounds have decided to join us today, including community lawyers, pro bono lawyers, staff of MPs and government departments, advocates, academics, students, and last but probably most importantly, people with lived experience of all the issues that we're covering. Thank you for joining us, and I'm so looking forward to some really fantastic discussions today. I'd now like to hand over to Genevieve Bolton, who's the Chair of Economic Justice Australia and Principal Solicitor, Executive Director of Canberra Community Law, to open our conference. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks very much, Leanne. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Economic Justice Australia Board, staff and membership, I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia we are meeting on. I pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are absolutely delighted that Auntie Mary Atkinson has joined us to welcome us to country today. Auntie Mary is a proud Aboriginal elder. She has 4 children and 14 grandchildren. She believes in reconciliation for all Australians and believes this will happen with lots of sitting and yarning together, and that we all have a role to play in this. She has worked in education for over 22 years. Thanks so much, Auntie Mary, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today. I'm actually Violet's sister, so and she's not well today, so I'm coming to you from the beautiful land of the Ngunnawal people also. So it's a pleasure to stand in for her today and perform a welcome to country for your very, very important conference here today. It's listening to some of it. It is very important that we are all coming together and speaking up for our rights and our justice. So with that, I'll do a welcome to country. I'm a proud Ngunnawal elder, and I've been given permission by my elders to perform my welcome to country. So there is a process around that. It's from lots of sitting and yarning with our elders, and then they say it's your turn to take the ropes, as to say, like, and then we get up and we do too, because that's how we sustain our society. Every time a formal welcome to country is given, it continues a tradition that has always been a part of Aboriginal culture, except for a recent lapse of about 200 plus years. It was given by the way of welcome when permission was granted to visit different tribal areas. You had to wait until you were welcomed into that country to have safe passage. When we talk about traditional country, we mean something beyond the dictionary definition of the word. For Aboriginal Australians, we might mean our homeland or tribal or clan area, and we mean more than just a place on the map. For us, country is a word for all the values, places, resources, stories, and cultural obligations associated with this area. It describes the entirety of our ancestral domain. It is on this land, the Ngunnawal land, that my people, my ancestors cared, lived, learned and raised their families. I acknowledge and pay my respects to my elders, both past, present and the future. I also extend that respect to any other First Nations people. Forever we are today in Cyberland, all of Australia is sacred country, and we all walk gently on that. So I extend that respect to all people that are joining us today. I invite you all to learn in this place and remember that well before the buildings, computers, cyberland, the Ngunnawal people lived upon this land and continue to have a connection. So I ask you today to live and care for this beautiful country. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I just want to say something about this year's NAIDOC theme, which I think is probably a bit more to do with you guys as well, how you stand up for justices and to right some wrongs and help people within community. So this year's NAIDOC theme was get up, stand up and show up. And we are doing that by getting up, standing up, showing up every day for the injustices that are happening in our communities and for our people that cannot stand up and talk for themselves. From the frontier wars and our earliest resistance fighters to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities fighting for change, today we continue to show up. Now is our time. We cannot afford to lose momentum for change. We all must continue to get up, stand up and show up for systematic change and keep rallying around our mob and our elders and our community. Whether it's seeking proper environmental, cultural heritage protection, constitutional change, a comprehensive process of truth telling, working towards treaties or calling out racism, we must do it together. It must be a genuine commitment by all of us to get up, stand up and show up and support and secure institutional, structural, collaborative and cooperative reforms. It must be a genuine commitment by all of us to get up, stand up and show up and support and secure those reforms. It is also time to celebrate the many who have driven and led change in our communities over generations. They have been the heroes and champions change of equal rights and basic human rights. Get up, standing up and showing up can take many forms. We need to move beyond just an acknowledgement, good intention, empty words and promises, and hollow commitments. Enough is enough. The relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous Australians needs to be based on justice, equity, and the proper recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights. So let's all get up, stand up, show up with amplify our voices and narrow the gap between aspirations and reality, good intentions and outcomes. Get up, stand up and show up with each other today. Welcome, and I'll welcome you from Ngunnawal country, and I just hope this all have safe passage and welcome on the sacred country wherever you are today. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Have a great meeting.
Thank you so much, Auntie Mary, for such a moving and wonderful welcome to country and for reminding us of the theme for NAIDOC Week and the importance of us all getting up, standing up, showing up and working together. Yeah. Without further ado, I'd like to declare the conference officially open and hand back to Leanne to introduce the first session.
Just unmute, Leanne.
Thanks so much, Jen. We're actually running early, which is amazing for a conference. Do we have Catherine Liddle and Sophie Trevitt ready to go?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Lucia. Well, this gives us extra time, which I know Catherine Liddle in particular will be happy about, because when I asked Catherine to join us at the conference, and we were so pleased that she was happy to come and speak with us, she said to me, Leanne, I don't stick to time. So I'm so pleased to be able to give you a few extra minutes. So please let me introduce Sophie Trevitt, CEO of Change the Record, and Catherine Liddle, CEO of SNAICC, a voice for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, to speak about why a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament is essential from a social security perspective. Thank you, Sophie and Catherine.
Thanks, Leanne. Yuma everyone, I'm Sophie. I'm the Executive Officer of Change the Record and a lawyer at Canberra Community Law. I'm zooming in from Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I will speak very briefly this morning. I'll speak as a social security lawyer and a non-Indigenous person about why all of our work should be concerned with First Nations justice. And then I will hand over to the formidable Catherine Liddle, who will talk us through the role that the voice can play in closing the gap in making our laws better, fairer, and more just. So I've got 3 points that I'd like to make this morning. The first is that the social security system continues the coercive legacy of colonisation, and this government and previous governments' attempts to control Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives. There could be no clearer example than the cashless debit card inquiry last week. We welcome the decision by the Albanese government to repeal the cashless debit card, but still we sat through inquiries where politicians debated how much and whether they should have control over First Nations people's lives and how they spend their money. The second is that the social security system actively drives people into poverty, and disproportionately, it drives First Nations people into poverty. Using any indicator and any poverty line, Centrelink payments are below it. This is government policy that quite literally promotes poverty. And the third point that I'd like to make is that elements of our social security system are cruel and dehumanising and need to change. One of the clearest examples of that is mutual obligations. We know that there are mutual obligations that force people to search for jobs that simply don't exist, force people to do menial tasks like sweep dirt in Yundamove, the CDP. And these forms of mutual obligations are racist, they're wrong, they're ineffective, and they need to be repealed. So what do we do about it, and what is our role as non-Indigenous allies? We all have a role in not just advising our clients about the law as it is, but also in advocating and advising government and the public about the law as it should be. We have a role in fighting for First Nations people to be at the front and the centre of the conversation and taking a step back and making sure their voices are elevated. And on that note, I will now hand over to Catherine to talk about how the voice is an important instrument in achieving that. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, and hello everyone. My name is, as mentioned, Catherine. I'm a Liddle. So if you're familiar with the Northern Territory, you'll know that that name is also synonymous with Alice Springs, being an Mbundirrinya person or belonging to Alice Springs, and the Mbundirrinya are a group of the Central Arrernte who belong to the Great Arrernte Nation. But that being said, it is always my great privilege to acknowledge that I'm not currently on my own homelands. I'm on Liddle country, that great top-end nation. So I had two options actually this morning, and one was to talk to you from the hotel room where the air conditioner was making a revolting noise, or come outside where you can also hear the pool and the air conditioners, but at least you can see the beautiful country. So I'm going to not apologise if there's background noise, because that's just what it is, but acknowledge that if you can hear a bit of noise in the background, it's because I'm outside and enjoying the fact that I'm here on the great lands of the Larrakia. What a pleasure, what an absolute pleasure to be with you all. I'll also be honest and say I had a little bit of a heart attack when we were coming in early, because you know that moment when you open your computer and it says fatal error? No more memory, can't perform this operation. Anyhow, it looks like it's found enough memory to enable me to have this conversation with you, which is fantastic, because what we're looking at this moment in time is an extraordinary moment in time. It's a time when everyone appears to be at the table and wanting to share insights and learnings from each other, and that acknowledgement that in actual fact, you know, we talk about things like leadership and creating space, but we're all leaderships. We're all leaders in our own spaces. You know, we all have the ability to change conversations, to influence, to ensure that we are bringing mob along at this incredible junction. What I also find quite remarkable is not so long ago, the thought that I'd be in a room with you, or that even SNAICC would be in a room with you, was not even on our radar. And yet clearly it was something that we were meant to do, and it was a space we were meant to open up into and to step into, to be able to share our stories. We know that on the ground there is this incredible, I don't know, I guess you got to call it a feeling or movement, and a push for fairness in our country. And we saw that even in the last election, where people changed what they were voting for, and they said, listen, as a country, we need fairness. We need to be caring about each other. And there is this underlying desire to right injustices, not only ones that we see, but the ones that we inherited as a country and perhaps weren't part of the creation of, but certainly are benefactors of. And I think the move towards a constitutionally enshrined voice is absolutely evidence of that. And as pointed to in the opening statements, you know, none of these movements happened overnight, and none of these movements happened in isolation. If I were to root it in the conversation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, as many of you know, which was endorsed in May 2017. So even that 4 years ago, after quite an exhaustive process of dialogue and deliberation, created and conducted by the Referendum Council. And that campaign for constitutional change to enshrine recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our country's foundational document is very, very much front and centre of everything we're hearing from the federal government, and certainly was a major part of their campaign. To see it growing support for change is heartening and uplifting. And I think what we're also being buoyed by is that underlying shift that is about giving more emphasis and more support to the work being done under Closing the Gap. So the voice obviously is the headline piece of work, right? We need that because in order for that to happen, for genuine transformation to come through, we need that piece of work. But we also know that the agreement gives us the leverage and the opportunity to change things and turn things around with this new federal government. So it was, again, very heartening to see that the gains that we've made under the new agreement wouldn't be dismissed or forgotten as we went for the headline piece. So that's fantastic. We've heard the Federal Labor Party say we are absolutely committed to the implementation of the national agreement with the Coalition of Peaks. And this agreement, which I'll talk about a little bit further down the line, was absolutely transformational in the way that it was in its identification of what we're calling priority reforms. And one thing we know about priority reforms is they were negotiated by Aboriginal people on the ground, from the ground up, saying these are the services that we need, this is what we need to change, and this is how you need to change as a government in order for us to achieve that. But not only to achieve that government to change, but these are the levers we need in place to start thinking about that overall system change. How do we influence people around us as well? There's absolutely no doubt that, you know, when you have a federal election, you lose a little bit of ground, right? You lose a little bit of ground, but we think that these things are starting to come up to where they need to be. And of course, we've been very active, like the rest of the Coalition of Peaks, in making sure we're at the round tables on workforce, because they are absolutely critical to being able to get away from, you know, the mutual obligations of CDP, and to start looking at new ways to create jobs and start to look at new ways in which we acknowledge the economies that are actually on communities. You know, as I've said, we've seen a massive, we believe, commitment on Friday when the Joint Council, which is made up by federal government ministers, Commonwealth government ministers and local government representatives and the Coalition of Peaks representatives. And they got together and said, listen, it is time to put the shoulder to the wheel, and we have the will to do it. So I might talk about why that is absolutely significant. But again, also acknowledge, in line with all those things that we've just said before, It didn't happen overnight, and anything that is happening now is absolutely the result of the people that walked before us and the people that fought before us. And that includes not only our own leaders, but the leaders in rooms like this as well. So how does it work, right? How does it work? The National Agreement is about creating fairer and more just systems and services. And it's work that has to happen in tandem with the work on constitutional recognition and voice. So in many ways, when we're talking about these two things, and they'll get confusing over the period of time while we're discussing the movement and the change that's happening, and so why it's important for you to understand the difference. But they are complementary, and they are driving the work that is fundamentally about creating a better future, not for only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but Australia as a nation. And I guess the easy way to say that is, you know, while it sounds like a motherhood statement, it is nation building and nation changing. But like I said, I'm going to take you back a few years so that you understand where it came from. So the coalition of peaks came together to change the way Australian governments work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, organisations and communities on closing the gap. The original Closing the Gap policy, which was agreed in 2008 by the Council of Australian Governments, was designed as a nationally coordinated effort to improve the lives of our people. Sounds good, doesn't it? Always sounds good. What we know is that while there was some level of consultation with some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in what the policy could be and what its related programs could be, there was never full ownership actually given to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what we also know is when those things are designed without appropriate engagement from us, given that they impact on us and our understanding of what is successful and how you get success, but not only that, how you measure success, just doesn't work. And it became very much an initiative of the government. And again, if I root it in the conversation that we had, that brought us into this point in time, you know, CDP is a bit of a nightmare, really. And yet before governments turned CDEP into CDP, it was a way in which our communities were able to use those commitments from federal government around social security benefits to actually create real jobs for people on the ground for the communities. And that included things like leave and super. When things were slightly off key in certain areas, instead of fixing it, government said, actually, we're going to redesign it, not with the way that you have implemented it, not with the way that you've understood to develop your economies. We're going to make it better. In actual fact, they didn't. And a lot of that saw businesses disappear overnight, jobs disappear overnight, and that feeling of well-being disappear overnight. So in 2016, coming back to track again, COAG was looking for an update on closing the gap. And Aboriginal leaders essentially said, we're not 100% okay with this, because since it's been happening, very little has changed. Yeah, you've got the targets there, but those targets represent what you believe is our success, and we're not happy with it. And if you're going to go forward with this, then you really need to be sincere and create the opportunity for our mob to be involved. And they looked at it and they said, well, how do we do that? So they got together, a whole heap of Aboriginal community-controlled peaks got together, and they wrote to the Prime Minister and other heads of government to insist that any changes to the Closing the Gap targets had to happen with formal input and support from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So a formal way of doing business together. So the Coalition of Peaks was formed in early 2019 to start work on what that agreement would look like. So it came into full effect in 2020, and it was signed off by the Coalition of Peaks, the Prime Minister, Premiers, Chief Ministers, and the President of the Australian Local Government Association. And it represented a watershed moment in time. And that is the first time an intergovernmental national agreement designed to improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been developed and negotiated between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives. Like, this was watershed, and something that, again, at a time not so far long ago, we would have thought could never happen. The other thing that was fundamentally different about this point in time is that the refreshed approach to closing the gap is not just about measuring our lives against targets, right? We pushed back on that and said they are things governments use. What we need is a fundamental reform in the way that you talk to us, in the way that you value us, in the way that we are able to use our information, our skill sets, our expertise to change the lives of our mob. And in actual fact, what we know underlying all of that is, despite the fact that people have been putting investment into services that are designed to close the gap, very little of those dollars was landing in the Aboriginal community controlled sector. And yet the outcomes from the Aboriginal community controlled sector were significantly better. And there was no accountability for the fact that that continued to happen. So we had to find a different way to work with governments. And that was genuinely saying there's a system, I hate the word system, but we also needed systemic change. I always get in trouble from our comms people when I use that word systemic. Apparently I'm going to get fined every time I say it, but it is the word, it is systemic. So we were, SNAICC was there at the table and was certainly a proud foundation member of the Coalition of the Peaks. And we have played a critical and instrumental role in negotiating the priority reforms and targets that impact our children. And again, acknowledging that none of the work SNAICC does would happen if our mob weren't absolutely committed to coming to the table again and again and again to tell us what was happening and what was needed. So I'll talk to you a little bit about why they come to the table, despite the fact that they've come to many tables with very little change over many, many years. So SNAICC was established more than 40 years ago in recognition of the need to celebrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families, their communities, and the culture in which they belong. And we are the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. It's our job to make sure that our children and our families have rights and that they're aware of their rights, and that we can advocate the need to ensure our people have access to that, have opportunities that other people take for granted. So we work with government, we advocate at all levels of government, but also outside of government with our peers and our allies, about understanding what it is that keeps our children and our young people and our families safe and strong and connected to culture. And that movement, again, came from community. SNAICC was built from the ground up, and those voices were strong and they were powerful, and they were built on the experiences of our children and our young people, our families and our communities who've said, it's not okay, you haven't treated us very well. You have not treated us very well. The treatment of our children is gross. And again, a lot of the work that we've done through the coalition was to ensure that children were front and centre. So you'll have seen changes in targets that put things like out-of-home care on the radar to say it is not okay that the number of our children hitting out-of-home care is continuing to go up. It's not okay that the number of our children hitting juvenile detention facilities continues to increase. It's not okay that we're thinking that it's okay just to enrol someone in a school or a preschool. You actually have to be able to succeed when you're in there. And that's really what our underlying and driving force is. It is our job and our mission to amplify all those voices and to effect real change in the systems that were designed without us. So those systems, as I've touched on, they're things like social welfare. And as we've heard, mandatory income management and the CDP have had an absolutely devastating impact on children and families. Yesterday I was in Alice Springs and it came through in every conversation what the impact of CDP has been. The other thing that came up really strongly again, even though technically it started a long time ago, was the NT intervention and the follow-on Stronger Futures policies. These things had a fundamental change in our own empowerment, our own ability to solve our problems and manage our own resources. And yet there was little to no proof of any benefit for children and families or anyone else. In actual fact, what we saw was more punishment, and their punitive policies that were apparently supposed to rescue us and save us. Again, going back to the data, because governments like data, What we know is our children continue to be moved from our families. They continue to be disconnected from kin and culture, and they continue to end up in the justice system. Now, many of these children who come, particularly those who come from first language families, have been removed for so long that they can no longer speak the languages that they were born to. They no longer know who they are, and certainly we heard from the consultations on the ground yesterday that even in the Northern Territory, there are mob in the juvenile detention system that have been disconnected for so long they couldn't even tell you which mob they belong to anymore. This stuff is absolutely disgraceful and should never ever happen, particularly when we know as Aboriginal people what works. And the irony of this does our head in, because we're consistently told about these frameworks that are developed overseas and they're so successful and they're built on this evidence, blah, blah, blah. You know what? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have been successfully raising our children for more than 60,000 years. Note, I didn't use the word ancient there. I know that that one comes up a lot, but there's a reason I don't use the word ancient, because like all communities, our culture has evolved over time. You know, it has responded to the changing needs of the environment. But our core understanding of grandmother's law, which is to care for all children as if they were your own, has remained the same and adapted to these particular environments that we live in today. That is how you survive for 60,000 years. I think, again, if I was to root it in the conversation for today, if you look to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it tells us that our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. It reminds us that this cannot be because we have no love for them. And it tells us that our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers, and yet they should be our hope for the future. And again, if I bring that back to the Closing the Gap targets, you know, the Productivity Commission released them not so long ago. And what we saw was some positive movement in the juvenile detention figures. But you know what that loses? The fact that the numbers are still grotesque, absolutely grotesque and unacceptable. So yes, we've got to celebrate small wins, but we cannot lose focus on the fact that these are still not okay. So that's why we do what we do. It's why we continue to come to the table to advocate for change. It's why those agencies that we work for, those communities that we represent, those children and families who need pathways for their voices to be seen in policy keep coming to the table. And again, it's why agencies like us and the Coalition of Peaks have always supported a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament on laws and policies that impact on us and our communities, our organisations and our families, and for SNAICC, obviously, our children. So the National Agreement and the priority reforms also apply to how the proposals are developed for the referendum on the voice. And again, when we're on the ground, one of the biggest fears we hear from people, even though we don't necessarily consult on the voice, is don't let this happen without us. How do we get our voices into those rooms? I know when it comes to system and service delivery, we've got some incredible levers. So we know that the government agreed to those priority reforms, and those priority reforms apply to all policies and programs that have a significant impact on our people's lives. And a referendum on a First Nations voice clearly fits this definition. It means that there needs to be a formal arrangement put in place that would enable shared decision-making between the government and First Nations representatives on the approach to the referendum and any proposals. That said, the Coalition of Peaks has been abundantly clear that it is critical that the Labor government progress the full implementation of the National Agreement with the same effort and attention it gives to the voice, because this is about service delivery and it is happening now and it cannot stop and wait for a voice. Both efforts are incredibly important, but it is possible to pursue both, and we of course expect nothing less. We need all governments to show that they are prepared to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, and these voices that have been saying the same thing for decades. We know what works, we know what we need. There is so much change we need to see, but this genuinely feels like a watershed moment. It genuinely feels like we might actually get this through. As I said earlier, on Friday, the Joint Council on Closing the Gap did meet with the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, in the co-chair seat for the very first time. And as part of that, as SNAICC, we were really, really excited to see that the new policy partnership for early childhood care and development was approved. These policy partnerships, again, they identify new opportunities to work more effectively across governments to reduce gaps and duplication and improve the outcomes under closing the gap, because they not only bring in peak bodies, but they bring in communities as well to say, how are we going? This is about looking for more accountability in the policies and looking at solving problems as they emerge, not waiting 3 years down the track to say, oh, hang on, that didn't work. How did we miss that? So it's our hope that for early childhood care and development, what we'll see is progress on critical reforms that have been previously blocked. And a lot of this from a lack of will, to be perfectly honest, that's what it is, a lack of will. And this deeply, deeply entrenched systemic racism. They're always hard words, those ones, hey, because sometimes they either offend people or people go, I don't really understand what that means. But that is the for lack of a better term, the God's honest truth, that our systems are deeply entrenched with systemic racism. And that includes...
Catherine, can I just jump in, because we've only got a few minutes left and I've got about 10 questions here from the audience.
Excellent. I'm almost finished. So do you want me to wrap up there or do you want me to finish it off?
We've got 2 minutes. So could we ask you one question? And systemic is one of our favourite words too. So systemic racism is a really great place to finish off. So this is a question for both Catherine and Sophie. Is the bill abolishing the cashless debit card scheme going to be enough in its current form to start the process of abolishing mandatory income management on the whole? Or should the first step be broader than what the bill is proposing?
Look, I think, again, that's where we talk about the systemic reform piece. Absolutely. I think we've got to move on it. If we've got a moment now to abolish it, abolish it. It is awful. It is absolutely awful. As someone who lives in, Alice Springs, where we were really the first group of people where that was imposed on, the impact immediately of not being able to do things like even get things off buy, swap, sell, right? Can't even do that. Every time you walk into a shop, there's your card. There is your card telling and everyone else that you're paying for this with taxpayers' money. That's what it is. It is a reminder to everyone. I mean, where's the dignity in that? It has to go, and that is one way of doing it. We're very big on not slowing down. We've got to keep moving. But again, that is where the will around those systemic reforms and closing the gap have to kick in, because what we know is often these things would get a win, but the systemic reforms and this change to service delivery around them aren't broad enough, and the scaffolds weren't brought in fast enough, and then we go, oh, that was the problem, as opposed to we didn't move the system fast enough.
Last word on this, Sophie?
I completely agree with what Catherine has said. I mean, one of the things that we've been advocating for is abolish the cashless debit card, but make sure people aren't just transitioned then onto the basics card, which is what the legislation currently allows. And that's just another form of income management and controlling Aboriginal people's lives. So absolutely, this is a step forward, but there's also a real opportunity now for the government to say, as Catherine has said, there's a systemic problem here. We've got the Closing the Gap agreement. We're moving towards the voice. We recognise that Aboriginal people have the right to self-determination and make decisions about their own lives. Why is the government hanging on to controlling how people spend their money?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sophie and Catherine. And we will be putting that question to Minister Rishworth when she joins us later this morning. Thank you very much for your time this morning.